The familiar click of the front door latch sent a jolt through me. I glanced up from my laptop to see Keith shuffle in, his expression grave. Something was off. "Nora, we need to talk," he said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. My heart sank. Those 4 words never boded well. "What's wrong?" He sank onto the couch beside me, shoulders slumped. I've been fired. The company let me go due to downsizing." A deafening silence hung between us as the weight of his words sank in. Fired? But Keith was one of their top sales managers. This had to be some mistake. "Are you sure? Maybe there's been some misunderstanding." "It's done, Nora." He cut me off, his voice laced with defeat. I cleaned out my desk this afternoon. Panic gripped me as the implications crashed over my head. Keith's income represented almost half our household finances. How are we going to cover the mortgage, bills, my student loans? I reached for his hand, trying to keep my voice steady. "It'll be okay, we'll figure this out. You know I'm here for you." He pulled away, jaw clenched. "Easy for you to say. Your job is secure." "Keith, don't do this. We're a team, remember?" I hated how desperate I sounded, but the prospect of losing everything we'd built terrified me. He let out a mirthless chuckle. "Yeah, some team." The bitterness in his tone sliced through me. This wasn't just about the job loss. There was a deeper resentment simmering under the surface. Before I could respond, he rose abruptly. "I need some air." The door slammed behind him, leaving me alone with the sickening realization that our life was crumbling. And this was only the beginning. The weeks following Keith's firing were some of the darkest of my life. Our once warm home had become a tinderbox of resentment and hostility. Keith's job search dragged on with no prospects in sight. I did what I could to lift his spirits, but my attempts were met with sullen silence or outright hostility. "I got another rejection letter today," he spat one evening, tossing a crumpled envelope across the kitchen. "Seems no one wants to hire a has-been like me." I set down the dishes I'd been drying. "You can't give up, Keith. Something will come through." His eyes narrowed. "Easy for you to say, Miss Hotshot Marketing Executive." The venom in his voice stung. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means, while I'm out pounding the pavement, you're living it up in your fancy corner office." He jabbed an accusing finger at me. "You have no idea what I'm going through." White-hot anger flared within me. "I'm doing everything I can to support us. Maybe if you put in half the effort." "Save the pep talk." He cut me off with a dismissive wave. "I'm going out." The door slammed, leaving me trembling with a toxic mix of rage and sorrow. What happened to the caring, supportive man I'd married? My workload only intensified in the following months as I scrambled to keep us afloat financially. I'd come home past midnight, physically and emotionally drained, only to find Keith zoned out in front of the TV. "Working late again?" he'd grunt, not bothering to look up. I longed for even a shred of compassion, of understanding that I was shouldering our burdens alone. But his resentment had calcified into impenetrable bitterness. One night, I returned to the stench of stale beer hanging in the air. Keith was slumped on the couch, surrounded by empty cans. "Keith!" I nudged his shoulder, but he remained motionless, passed out cold. That's when I noticed his laptop lying open beside him, the screensaver displaying poker chips whirling around a neon table. A gnawing suspicion took root as I scrolled through his browsing history. Gambling sites, dozens of them, all visited with alarming frequency. My heart plummeted. No, surely not. But the truth was inescapable. While I killed myself at work, Keith had been frittering away what little we had left. I slumped to the floor, hot tears streaking my cheeks. Our marriage was hanging by the frailest of threads. I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief and simmering rage. Keith's gambling addiction had been festering right under my nose while I slaved away to keep us afloat. When he finally resurfaced, bleary-eyed and reeking of cheap booze, I was ready to confront him. "We need to talk," I said, my voice trembling with barely contained fury. He blinked at me owlishly. "What's wrong? What's wrong?" I shoved his laptop in his face, gambling sites littering the browsing history. "This is what's wrong, Keith. How could you?" Understanding dawned in his bloodshot eyes, quickly replaced by defiance. "So what? It's just a harmless way to blow off steam." "Harmless?" I sputtered. "Do you have any idea how much of our savings you've pissed away on this nonsense?" He shrugged, nonchalant. "It's not that big a deal. I'll win it back eventually." The casual dismissal of his reckless actions was like a slap across my face. Not a big deal. We're drowning in debt because of you. His expression hardened. Don't act so high and mighty. If you hadn't been working yourself to the bone, maybe I wouldn't have needed an escape. White-hot rage lanced through me at his twisted attempt to shift the blame. An escape? From what, Keith? The responsibility of being a husband and provider? He recoiled as if struck. For a moment, I thought I'd finally gotten through to him, but his next words extinguished that flicker of hope. You want to know why I gamble? His tone dripped with venom. Because at least at the tables, I can be a winner, not a pathetic loser like I am in real life. My heart shattered into a million pieces at the self-loathing in his voice. This man was not the Keith I'd married. That caring, driven man was gone, devoured by his demons. You're unbelievable, I choked out, blinking back hot tears. If that's how you really feel, then maybe you should just leave. His gaze turned flinty. Maybe I will. He stormed out, leaving me alone to crumple to the floor, racked with sobs. After everything I'd sacrificed to keep us going, this was how he repaid me? With wanton disregard and cruelty? In that moment, I knew our marriage was beyond saving. The man I loved was lost to me forever. Despite the gut-wrenching realization that my marriage was crumbling, some foolish part of me still clung to the hope of salvaging it. I told myself, if I could just eliminate the financial stress driving Keith's vices, he might find his way back to me. So when my next paycheck arrived, I didn't deposit it into our joint account as usual. Instead, I withdrew enough cash to pay off every last cent of debt Keith had racked up gambling. It took several furtive trips to countless shady online lenders, but I settled every outstanding balance, one by one. The massive pile of money I'd handed over made me physically ill, but I told myself it was for the best. A small price to pay to remove that burden from our lives. When Keith returned home that night, I was awaiting him with a brave smile. Keith, we need to talk. He tensed, obviously anticipating another blow-up. What now? I took a deep breath. I know about the gambling debts. His face drained of color. Nora, I can explain. I held up a hand to silence him. It's okay. I paid them off. For a long moment, he simply gaped at me in stunned disbelief. Then, finally, You did what? Every single debt, gone, I affirmed. It's a clean slate for us. Rather than the gratitude I'd expected, his expression contorted in anger. You had no right, I recoiled. This was not the reaction I'd envisioned. I was just trying to help. By going behind my back? He snarled. Did it never occur to you that I'm the man of this house, that I should have been the one handling it? The sheer audacity of his words struck me speechless. I just sacrificed thousands to dig him out of the hole he dug, and this was how he responded? You're unbelievable, I managed finally. After everything you've put me through? He jabbed a finger toward the door. Get out of my face before I say something I'll regret. Tears of mingled fury and heartbreak stung my eyes as I brushed past him. So much for a fresh start. Keith was too far gone, consumed by toxic pride and denial. Over the next few weeks, I waited in vain for any sign of remorse or gratitude from him, but his behavior only grew more erratic and hostile. He started coming home at all hours, reeking of alcohol with that now all too familiar glassy look in his eyes. One night, I finally snapped. Have you been gambling again? His lip curled in a contemptuous sneer. Yeah, so what if I have? White-hot rage roared through me. After everything I'd done, he was just going to throw it back in my face. In that moment, I knew there was no saving this farce of a marriage. Keith was beyond redemption, poisoned by his vices. It was time to cut my losses before they destroyed me too. The following months were a waking nightmare as I desperately tried to salvage my life, while Keith spiraled deeper into his addictions. I was running on fumes, pushing myself to the brink at work to keep the income flowing. But no matter how many hours I billed, it never seemed to be enough. The money would disappear almost as quickly as it came in, siphoned away by Keith's insatiable need to gamble and drink himself into oblivion. Where does it all go? I demanded one night, waving a stack of overdue notices in his bleary face. He swatted them away with a drunken scowl. Get off my back, Nora. You're not my mother. No, I'm just the one killing myself to put a roof over our heads while you flush our future down the toilet. I exploded. In that moment, something shifted in his unfocused gaze. A cruel sneer twisted his lips. If you hate it so much, then leave. See if I care. The callous indifference in his voice was like a physical blow. Stunned, I could only gape at the monster he'd become. This complete lack of remorse, of empathy, where was the man I'd married? My anguished silence seemed to embolden him. That's what I thought. You'll never leave because you're terrified of being alone. White-hot shame and fury roiled within me, but I couldn't form a retort. Some hateful part of me feared he was right. In the end, the punishing toll of overwork and emotional turmoil caught up to me. One morning, I awoke feeling like I'd been hit by a truck, feverish, achy, and so drained I could barely get out of bed. When Keith lumbered in later, I managed to croak out, "I don't feel well. Can you make me some soup?" He barely even looked at me. "You're a big girl, Nora. Figure it out." His utter disregard for my well-being was the final straw. Through the haze of illness, a cold clarity washed over me. This man was no longer my husband. He was a selfish, toxic leech, sapping me of my health, my joy, my sense of self-worth. As I lay there, burning up with fever yet chilled by his callousness, I finally accepted what I'd been denying for so long. My marriage was dead. Worse, it was poisoning every aspect of my life. For my own sanity, I had to walk away before it destroyed me completely. When I emerged from my bedroom days later, it was with a new sense of resolve. Keith was slouched in his usual spot, glazed eyes glued to the TV. "We need to talk," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. He tensed, bracing for another fight. "What is it this time?" I drew a fortifying breath. "I want a divorce." Those 3 words hung in the air like a grenade. For a long moment, Keith simply stared at me, uncomprehending, then his face contorted in rage. "A divorce? Are you out of your mind?" I stood my ground, my resolve hardening. "I've never been more serious. This marriage is slowly killing me, Keith. I can't do this anymore." He shot to his feet, fists clenched. "You ungrateful bitch. After everything I've sacrificed." Sacrificed? I couldn't help but laugh, though it came out choked with anguish. "All you've done is leech off me while indulging your vices." His eyes went flinty. "You think you can just cut me loose after soaking up the best years of my life? I'll take you for everything you're worth." The venom in his voice should have stoked my anger, but instead an icy dread gripped me. I knew that look all too well. He wasn't just lashing out. He was deadly serious. "Don't do anything rash," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "We can discuss terms, divide assets fairly." "Fairly?" He let out a harsh bark of laughter. "You're damn right, I'm taking what's fair. Maybe then you'll learn not to screw over your husband." Before I could respond, he stormed out, the door slamming hard enough to rattle the walls. I stood there, rooted to the spot, as the full implications of his threat sank in. This wasn't just about our failed marriage anymore. Keith was going to try and bleed me dry out of pure, vindictive spite. Over the next few weeks, the divorce proceedings kicked into high gear, and true to his word, Keith didn't hold back. My client was the primary breadwinner for years before being wrongfully terminated. His shark of a lawyer sneered during one particularly vicious hearing. He sacrificed his prime earning years in service of the marriage. As such, he's entitled to substantial compensatory alimony and a significant share of Miss Reynolds' assets. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Keith had barely worked in over a year, having lost his job due to his own ineptitude. Yet here he was, brazenly lying through his teeth to try and drain me of every penny. "That's preposterous," I burst out. "He was fired for underperformance, and I have documentation proving—" "Save it for the stand, Miss Reynolds." The judge cut me off with an impatient wave. "Mr. Reynolds' case seems reasonably compelling at this stage. I'm inclined to approve temporary spousal support until this can be properly adjudicated." I slumped back in my seat, reeling from the gut punch. How could this bastard be winning? Using my own hard-earned money as a bludgeon against me? As I watched Keith smirking at me from across the aisle, I knew I was staring into the abyss of total ruin if I didn't do something drastic. But what? How could I possibly combat his campaign of lies? That night, it hit me. A long-shot gambit, but one that could unmask Keith's treachery once and for all. I may have been backed into a corner, but I wasn't out of options yet. Not by a long shot. The next few months were a blur of legal proceedings and vicious mudslinging as Keith executed his scheme to portray himself as the wronged party entitled to my hard-earned assets. Miss Reynolds is an ambitious career woman who prioritized work over family, his lawyer oozed during one hearing. While admirable, it ultimately led to the deterioration of the marriage. My client shouldn't be punished financially for her priorities. I wanted to scream at the audacity of his lies, to expose Keith for the jobless deadbeat he'd become. But my lawyer cautioned me to keep quiet for now and let the facts speak for themselves later. Of course, Keith had no qualms about flagrantly disregarding the facts. Time and again, he spouted blatant fabrications about being the primary breadwinner, conveniently omitting his firing and subsequent descent into full-blown addiction. Mr. Reynolds lost his job due to circumstances beyond his control, the weasel of a lawyer declared. Despite his best efforts to find new employment, he was forced to deplete his savings and retirement accounts to keep the household afloat. I had to bite my tongue to keep from erupting. Keith's savings had been gambled away within months of his termination, yet here he was painting himself as the selfless martyr. The worst part, his bold-faced lies were working. The judge seemed increasingly inclined to rule in his favor, granting him a substantial cut of my earnings and assets as undeserved spousal support. After another particularly damning hearing, my own lawyer could barely mask his frustration. "I don't like this, Nora," he muttered, pinching the bridge of his nose. "That scumbag is spinning an awfully compelling narrative without a shred of proof. We need to regroup and hit back hard before it's too late." Panic gripped me at the prospect of Keith actually succeeding in his plundering. If he won, I'd be bled dry, all my years of hard work and sacrifice gone in an instant of malicious vengeance. That night, I tossed and turned, my mind spinning with desperation. There had to be some way to blow Keith's lies out of the water, some shred of evidence that could expose the truth once and for all. Then it hit me. A long-shot gambit, but one that could unmask Keith's treachery for what it was. I may have been backed into a corner, but I wasn't out of options yet. Not by a long shot. The next morning, I called an old friend who worked private security and laid out my plan. If this worked, it would turn the entire case on its head. But it was also a huge risk that could potentially backfire in spectacular fashion. "Are you sure about this?" Jack's gruff voice crackled over the line. "Because if I do this, there's no going back." I steeled myself, pushing aside any last shred of doubt. Keith has lied and manipulated enough. It's time he faced the consequences. There was a weighted pause then. "All right, let's burn this bastard." The die was cast. Now it was just a matter of waiting for Keith to slip up and expose his deceit once and for all. And when he did, I'd be ready to detonate the nuclear option right in his smug face. The next few weeks were agonizing as I waited for Jack to deliver the goods on Keith's treachery. Each court hearing brought more twisting of the truth from my soon-to-be ex-husband and his shyster lawyer. Given Mr. Reynolds' documented financial hardship, we believe long-term spousal support is not only warranted but essential, the weasel declared with an oily smirk. Failing to do so would constitute undue hardship. I had to grit my teeth to keep from erupting. Keith had brought every bit of his so-called hardship on himself through reckless vice and hubris. Yet here he was, boldly rewriting history to paint himself as the victim. The judge seemed to be eating it up too, nodding along with their fabrications as I watched in mounting dread. At this rate, I might as well start writing Keith those alimony checks now. When we adjourned for the day, my lawyer pulled me aside, his expression grave. "I don't like where this is headed, Nora. That snake is pushing hard for alimony and asset division that could clean you out if we don't mount an aggressive defense." My heart plummeted. "But I've provided all the documentation, Keith's termination details, the paper trail on his gambling debts. How can the judge just ignore all that?" He shook his head warily. "Facts don't seem to matter much when the other side is spinning a more compelling story. We need to regroup and hit back before it's too late." I managed a grim nod, but inside I was reeling. If the so-called justice system was just going to rubber-stamp Keith's lies, what chance did I have? The despair must have shown on my face because my lawyer's expression softened. "Hey, don't give up yet. We've got some tricks left up our sleeve, remember?" Right, the long-shot gambit I'd set in motion with Jack's help. It was a risky all-or-nothing play, but it was quickly becoming my only hope of salvaging anything from this nightmare. 2 days later, Jack's call finally came. Got the goods you were looking for and then some. This scumbag won't know what hit him. A grim smile tugged at my lips. Good, let's make this hit hard. The next hearing, I could feel the tension in the air as soon as I entered the courtroom. Keith was there, looking smug as ever in an expensive suit I knew he couldn't afford. Not anymore. Your Honor, I began once the proceedings started, keeping my tone measured. I'd like to submit some new evidence that I believe casts serious doubt on the plaintiff's claims of financial hardship. Keith's brow furrowed, but his lawyer waved a dismissive hand. Objection. This is clearly just another delaying tactic from the defendant. I'll allow it, the judge intoned. But get to the point, Miss Reynolds. Nodding, I slid a thick manila envelope across to the bench. Those are bank statements, phone records, even surveillance photos, all pointing to one inescapable conclusion, that Mr. Reynolds has been operating a highly lucrative online gambling operation for months, entirely funded by ill-gotten winnings. A hush fell over the courtroom as the judge leafed through the damning evidence, her expression darkening. Finally, she fixed Keith with a withering glare. Mr. Reynolds, you've shown an appalling pattern of deception in these proceedings. In light of this new evidence, I'm revoking your claims for alimony and asset division, effective immediately. This case is closed. Keith's outraged sputtering was music to my ears as the gavel cracked down. Finally, the debt of his misdeeds had come due in full. As the bailiffs let him out, I caught his eye one last time. The naked shock and hatred on his face was like a balm for all the pain and anguish he'd put me through. This was more than just victory. It was the ultimate revenge, to strip away every last ill-gotten gain and let the full consequences of his lies consume him. I was free to rebuild my life without his toxic influence. And Keith? His vices and arrogance had finally caught up to him.